Welcome back. This is Joel Duff, and this is an episode of This Week in Creationism, but this is a special edition. We have big breaking news. As of this morning, Martin Iles is out as CEO, executive CEO of Answers in Genesis. Yes, Answers in Genesis, the largest young earth creationist organization in the world that has been run and began and run by Ken Ham ever since it started. And now Answers in Genesis appears to be back to square one in terms of searching for the successor to Ken Ham. It's always hard to replace a charismatic founding leader of an organization. And way back actually, it's not that far back, just a year and 3 months ago, I was doing a special edition of This Week in Creationism. Special edition leadership transition at Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis has found the successor to Ken Ham. Ken Ham is transitioning leadership to a fellow Australian, Martyn Iles. And in this video, I was amazed. I had often wondered who would replace Ken Ham. How would they transition to another leader of basically young earth creationism? And I marveled at the fact that Ken Ham had found what I thought was a pretty worthy successor. I was shocked. I was surprised. He brought in an outsider. I had never been able to imagine who on the inside could replace Ken Ham. But Ken Ham managed to find a fellow Aussie. So you got the accent, that continues. A fellow Aussie who seems to have a passion for sort of the culture wars that Ken Ham has found himself embroiled in. And so somebody who would stand up very forthrightly for the authority of Scripture, who speaks out, who is a pretty darn eloquent speaker, I have to admit, probably much more effective than Ken Ham would be. He's a lawyer, he's very organized, but also has something of a sense of humor. All right, so anyway, I thought he had found all the pieces necessary in order to replace himself. Somebody who was probably of enough of a like mind to feel like he could take this essentially a family business, because Bodhi Hodge, his son-in-law, he has other family members that work for Answers in Genesis. And yet you're going to take this outsider and hand it off to an outsider. I never thought it could be somebody from the inside, because none of his close relatives really have the requisite sort of personality to be able to handle this particular position. But now you've got Martyn Iles brought in, and I thought, yeah, that could work. I really was fairly impressed and thought this is going to be a fairly smooth transition. A bunch of people were let go. They've sort of reduced some of their workforce while at the same time expanding into the, I'll say, the technology side of things. The school has expanded. They have continued to expand in their corporate center. But I had noticed that Martyn Iles' sort of public persona was not very great, all right, over the last year and a third, and especially over the last 6 months. I hadn't seen any real new information, new talks like him. He's not active on social media to the extent that Ken Ham is. In fact, I'd say Ken Ham's footprint has grown even larger over the last year. He's constantly making talks and on the front page of Answers in Genesis with his blog and with his tweets and so forth. And so I began to wonder, what's going on with Martyn Iles? What is he doing behind the scenes? What project could he be working on that is sort of advancing Answers in Genesis? It didn't really feel like, things were being handed off to okay, Ken Ham can start stepping back a little bit. Martyn Iles will begin to become more of the public face of Answers in Genesis. There was an initial push, and then all of a sudden Martyn Iles has kind of faded away. Well, now we're seeing that maybe for a while it's been obvious that relationship wasn't going to work out. Now we're going to speculate a little bit here about what has happened. Let's just start out with the facts first. All right. And so I can make it clear what my speculations are about the future transition. All right. The back to square one thing about how are they going to find a new successor for Ken Ham, who's now, I think, 73 years old. All right. So let me go back up to, oh yeah, by the way, here's Ken Ham introducing his new leader and talking about that transition. I'm sure that Ken Ham, in hiring Martyn Iles and sort of, taking his crown off and sort of trying to move it over and place it on Martyn Iles, he never expected Martyn Iles to be kind of come in and, I just a stepping stone, right? This is a stepping stone, a job I can do while I go on to do the thing that I really want to do. Now, I think that's what is being sort of portrayed now as the way to say that this was a mutual thing, that Martin Iles has other projects that he is more interested in and is going to take on new ministries and so forth, and couldn't really handle Answers in Genesis at the same time. I think that's kind of a smokescreen for what is typically happens in these cases, which are personality disagreements and just like core differences, and a realization by Martin Iles probably that this just isn't something he wants to do for the next 20 years. And I think Ken Ham was looking for someone who would like take the mantle and be around for 10, 15 years, or, go to retirement. Not just a placeholder, but a placeholder nonetheless is what Martin Iles was. There are a few sites, there are a few pages. Now, this has only happened in the last 24 hours. I mean, this has been percolating, I'm sure, for months, but in terms of making the break, this has only occurred in the last 24 hours. And since that time, Answers in Genesis website has pretty much been scrubbed of any mention of Martin Iles being involved in the ministry there. Now, he has made videos, he has written a few blog posts, those are still available. Here is one page I found on Answers in Genesis, which as of a few hours ago still existed. Martin Iles is an Australian lawyer, commentator, and preacher living in the US. He's executive CEO of Answers in Genesis, which isn't true anymore. I'm sure this page will be changed soon. Oh, and follow that up. Here's the bio sketch for Martin Iles that is right now present on Answers in Genesis website. Right? Lawyer, commentator, preacher living in Australia. And you notice here, no longer CEO of Answers in Genesis. Right? What has he done? He produced 2 YouTube programs for Answers in Genesis. That's the extent of his accomplishments, apparently, in the last 15 months, is he produced those 2 video series, and he did a number of different conferences. All right, so that relationship is done, and that leaves Answers in Genesis with a giant void, right? Really, a massive void. So at the same time today, Martin Iles, who had been relatively quiet, as he mentions here, some have noticed I've been quiet for a while. Yes, over the last month on his social media, he's been either completely absent or anything that he has said has not been related to Answers in Genesis. That's because I'm in the transition to something new. This is published today. In conjunction with some wise counsel and Christian colleagues, we're in the process of prayerfully discerning what's next, now that I'm no longer at Answers in Genesis. So this was his announcement that he's no longer at Answers in Genesis. This was breaking it to his followers that he's not at Answers in Genesis. We'll take a look in a moment at how Answers in Genesis is presenting this. But here, I think you get the impression that he's no longer there. He has other projects that he is interested in working on and exploring, but it's not like, hey, I've got this other gig. I've been hired. This is what I'm definitely going to do. This seems like, I no longer have an answer. I no longer have a job at Answers in Genesis, and so here are the things that I'm thinking of doing. He says, we do have a fantastic project, which appears to be coming together well. In other words, this has been percolating for a while. He's been thinking about this, obviously been contacting people and organizing something else, probably knowing the writing is on the wall. And I don't mean the writing is on the wall like he's going to get fired. It's more like, I know this isn't really the thing for me, and so I'm working on transitioning out of here. But Ken Ham is the one ultimately officially lets him go, as we're going to see in a moment. There's plenty of stuff going behind the scenes. I'm in the U.S. talking to donors, partners, suppliers. He's back in Australia for Easter. The project has a purpose to evangelize, educate, and entertain children and young people. It's a technologically revolutionary, integrated, accessible. Those words are interesting because Answers in Genesis, one of the things that I've talked about here on this channel a few times is they've really been pushing into AI and a bunch of different, mass media type things that involve using artificial intelligence and so forth. Martin Iles was never into science. He has no science background. And that's one of the things I talked about when I said he came. It's sort of like, well, he's going to be in charge of this Young Earth creationist organization. And yet, he's never really talked about Young Earth creationism up until the past couple years. I mean, he says he's a Young Earth creationist, but that's never been like his thing. That's another thing he's interested in. But then I said, that doesn't really matter because Ken Ham is not really interested in young earth creationism either. It's an apologetic tool for him. He's not really interested in the science. He's not interested in trying to uh, develop a scientific research program in order to somehow show that the earth is young and that biological organisms have changed rapidly just over the last 4,000 years. That's not really something he cares about that much. He's really interested in cultural issues and applying scriptures and doing biblical apologetics across every topic, right? The answers to all issues come from Genesis and beyond. And so I didn't really think about it at the time that, it didn't strike me as awkward that he's bringing in somebody that doesn't know anything about young earth creationism, because they're not really going to be supporting young earth creationist research or having a big say in that stuff anyway, because it's all about the sort of cultural issues and the applications of what he thinks you learn in Genesis to all these other cultural issues. So that's where Ken Ham's mind was, and that's where he's taking answers in Genesis. And that's why, to me, Martyn Iles was a good fit, because it seemed like that would be his focus as well. And we can see that now that he is gone, that where is his focus? It's on evangelism, right? I mean, he's interested in evangelism, which is a little bit different than this whole, I mean, it can be wrapped up in the cultural issues and so forth, but I think he's really more interested in like purely evangelistic endeavors, and not being involved in quite so many controversial issues. So look up at this other comment he just made 51 minutes ago when I copied this out of here, which was just before I began recording this. Lots of you asking how to be helped, how you can be involved. We're looking for talent support, exceptional teachers with a strong tech background, software, AI, data science, and so forth. Creatives in storytelling and production, immersive tech, gamification. And of course, he's raising capital. Whatever you know can offer, send me a message here and so forth. All right. So he's gathering resources in order to start his own ministry now that he doesn't have answers in Genesis. Now, I would have presumed that a lot of these things are ideas and things he wanted to explore at Answers in Genesis when he had the immense resources that Answers in Genesis has. So there has to be something really significant here about the direction he wanted to take this that did not comport with Ken Ham's views and Ken Ham's interest in where Answers in Genesis should go. So it's either, personality-wise, they don't fit, the mission-wise, they have disputes, that Martyn Iles felt trapped somehow and unable to do some things. And it's better to get out while the getting out's good instead of being more established over time and the ministry becoming more dependent. So Ken Ham, again, we don't know who's the initiator here, what the exact issues are, but nonetheless, breaking this off after only 15 months means we acknowledge this isn't going to happen in terms of the way that we both envision this, because I'm sure they both envision this as a long-term situation of guiding a organization into a more prominent institution in American politics and culture. That's Ken Ham's vision. So here's Martyn Iles just a couple months ago. He was in Britain and giving a conference for Answers in Genesis. And I noticed this comment, which he did make, 19 weeks ago, to somebody else's comment regarding that conference. Right, here's Martyn Iles. For all its problems, something in me can't help but love England. If anyone in London is hunting for a CEO preacher type, a CEO preacher type, that's an interesting description, right? Like executive pastor, right, of a mega church or mega organization in which I can preach, evangelize, right, but be in charge of a much larger program than simply preaching. I think that's what that is indicating. I come with British citizenship. Okay, a wardrobe of tweed suits and an Australian accent mild enough to be corrected within 3 years. He actually has a decent sense of humor as opposed to Ken Ham. which is another reason why I thought he would be, possibly have a chance to exceed Ken Ham's influence eventually if he stayed with Answers in Genesis. But interesting here that 19 weeks ago, he's saying like, hey, if anyone in London is hunting for a CEO preacher type. And I wouldn't have, if I'd seen this 19 weeks ago, I wouldn't have thought, oh, he's looking to get out of this Answers in Genesis thing. No, I don't think that thought, right? It's like, that's that's like an interesting, like, comment. He's having fun with it and so forth. But now looking back on it, it's like, maybe 19 weeks ago, it's already in his head. This Answers in Genesis thing is not where it's at for me. This isn't what I've been called to do. And so I'm looking for other opportunities out there. Like I said, here's his Facebook page. Started a new job at Answers in Genesis. I had to remind myself, actually May 10th, 2023. So almost 2 years ago. I've been saying 15 months, but May 10th was his official, like he was named as the CEO. But then there was a long transition time of him coming from Australia to the United States, and really, he was phasing out other things, and he wasn't really active in terms of really having an influence at Answers in Genesis till well into the summer or late summer there. Now, there's been very little news about this. I've already speculated on a bunch of stuff. Here's the only things we know, and even those things you have to take with kind of a grain of salt because they're in the, it's like all company announcements. They're trying to make sure that those who are donors and so forth don't start freaking out, right? So this isn't really going to tell the whole story. It's sort of like, here's our most positive spin we can possibly make on the situation. And so here from Vision Christian Media, there was a video made, and it had to have been authorized by Answers in Genesis because it includes Dan Flynn and Mike Foster, who is Dan Flynn is Chief Operating Officer, COO, and Mike Flynn is Managing Director at Answers in Genesis. Now, I had never heard of either of these people. And they shared, as it says here, a leadership update with some of this. So they were sort of, let's put you guys out here and sort of, let's let you be the ones that announce a new ministry being started by Martyn Iles. All right. Martin has been a senior leadership role for a couple of years in the U.S., says Dan, and we're very supportive of Ken Ham. Martin has also been a managing director here in Australia. The exciting news today is that Martin is going to be launching a new ministry. As I said, looking at him, yes, he has an interest in a new ministry. It's not ready to launch yet, obviously. So Ken has blessed him and encouraged him in that, and very much released him to this new opportunity. Now that's about as positive thing as you can say, right? It's like, hey, Ken Ham saw that you really feel led to do this other thing. And so if you want to couch it in biblical terms, it's like, God has called you to this other ministry. Now, of course, he would have said that God had called him to be Answers in Genesis CEO as well. Like that was the announcement originally. It's like, this is God's calling. And Martin was like, this is what this is what I've been put on earth to do. But there's been a change of heart, right? Obviously, God has called him away now from Answers in Genesis. And I think we can be sure, knowing just how politically savvy, those folks at Answers in Genesis are, that I think we know there has to be something more than this, because there was never going to be an intention that this was a short-term thing. Martyn Iles wasn't brought in to like fix some problem. All right. It's not like you bring in somebody to clean house and do the dirty work and then, now we'll move on. We'll bring somebody else in. No, he was viewed as the long-term fix, the successor. And if he was viewed as the successor and he was brought there with the feeling like he's the successor to Ken Ham, to carry on Ken Ham's mission, the fact he's gone in less than 2 years means there's something else. Right? Something had to change his mind. Something had to make him desire to start a new ministry that was different than Answers in Genesis ministry. So just a couple other things. Dan Flynn. Like I said, I didn't know anything about these other folks that are working at Answers in Genesis. So one of my first thoughts was, are maybe one of these individuals being set up to take over Answers in Genesis for Ken Ham? I don't think so. Dan Flynn seems to be potentially nearly the same age as Ken Ham. He, as you can see here, executive director of Australia at Answers in Genesis. And based on the wording of that that article I showed you a moment ago from that press release, it made it sound like he's executive director of Answers in Genesis, but maybe that meant Answers in Genesis at Australia. They forgot to say that. So I can't be sure that he is now at the U.S. organization, but he is Australian, right? And so he's involved. And then this other individual, Michael Foster, was also Australian. And he does seem to be somehow involved in the American organization, the director of I forget what the term was, director of something there. Oh, and as you can see here, he's on the board of Answers in Genesis Australia and a couple other ministries, but it seems like he might have more involvement in the U.S. ministry. Maybe he's filling some gap. So these aren't the solution. These individuals aren't the solution to who's going to succeed Ken Ham. And so that's why I think something. I think they're back to square one in terms of finding somebody to succeed Ken Ham. Martyn Iles was clearly that person, put in that position for that purpose. So it's not like they've been preparing anybody else for the last year for that. I mean, maybe the last couple of months they have once they realized that this wasn't going to work out. But who would be next? I don't know. I really don't know. There's only one person within the organization itself that I think has the charisma. Now, by charisma, I mean the brashness, the ability to be so outspoken, the ability it has a smooth tongue. Now, none of those things sound very good. That's because they're not, because Calvin Smith is one of the smoothest talking charlatans, at Answers in Genesis that I find is consistently able to get everything wrong and yet be extremely bold about it. I think he'd be a terrible choice for Answers in Genesis. Just absolutely horrible. But he is the biggest face of Answers in Genesis, and he has been pumping out videos over the last 6 months. Right. And blog posts, and he has probably been the most prolific writer of stuff that's been published at Answers in Genesis over the last 6 months to a year. And like I said before, he's made a bunch of videos. I think everybody who watches those, and I know I've done several critiques of Calvin Smith's videos, and just the smugness, the fake humor that he uses, really difficult to swallow. But he seems to be really popular among many of his followers. He gets a lot of views and a lot of likes on his particular videos, his particular style. I guess what I'll liken him to is he's a really smooth politician. Right. And the techniques that have allowed certain politicians today to become as powerful as they are very similar techniques to what Calvin Smith does and uses, and the type of wording he says, the way he creates dichotomous views, and the way he exaggerates things for particular effects. He's a master of information manipulation. And maybe that's what's going to win the day in terms of succeeding Ken Ham. I have no idea what their relationship is. I thought Calvin Smith was on the way out. At least he was sidelined by the fact that Martyn Iles was brought in. A number of other people left. Remember, Bodie Hoge, who's a son-in-law of Ken Ham, who was had a very high position in Answers in Genesis, was running the daily operations there. Martyn Iles comes in, Bodie Hoge is out, and he has been scrubbed from the website. All right, barely a mention of Bodie Hoge. Some of his materials are there that he had produced, but nothing in terms of activity, and he's off doing his own independent thing now. That is a very mysterious event. It just had all the appearances of I thought maybe I was going to be able to succeed, or I'd have more prominent role, and then all of a sudden this other person comes in and he was sidelined, and a clean break was made there. And so he's not around to do anything. So who's left at Answers in Genesis with any authority, with any like public persona that that feels like this is the successor? I mean, Nathaniel Jeanson, no, he's not a public speaker. Georgia Purdom, she's pretty smooth public speaker and sort of has a grip on everything that happens at Answers in Genesis, and is not doing the science thing. She's much more public facing in what she does, but it's still, she does not have the charisma that Ken Ham has or that Martyn Iles has. She's not going to have the public persona of the authority figure that I think that they need to hold together an organization like that and hold together all the different donors that they need to hold together and to advance the operation there, which I think Ken Ham has huge vision in terms of where this can go and how much influence it can have in American society. And so I think they're going to have to look outside at some sort of big mega pastor type person who wants to come in and use this ministry in a way that Ken Ham is favorably disposed toward. I don't know. Yeah, because if it's not Calvin Smith, I just don't know who else it is that we know of in the sphere of Answers in Genesis. And you know what? They're not going to bring in somebody from ICR, right? It's not like, hey, Jason Liesel out there, or Liesel, you know, it's who left Answers in Genesis in the past and then went to ICR and then left ICR and started his own ministry, but who's very well spoken and I think has a lot of skills. But there's no way that they're bringing him back. Okay, he's not coming back as CEO of Answers in Genesis, right? And nobody from any of the other organizations either. And he's burnt bridges with all kinds of other independent young Earth creationists, right? So there's not going to be anybody out there that is going to be a young Earth creationist who's like grew up as a young Earth creationist advocate, who's like totally into young Earth creationism as like their core identity. It's definitely going to be somebody from the outside that is much more involved in cultural, social issues. It's got to be somebody who's going to come in and make them grow into an even larger multimedia operation, right? It's about the videos. It's about education. It's about schools. It's about all that stuff, right? And it's also about lobbying, right? Lobbying politicians. It's about influencing politics in order to create the environment that will allow for Ken Ham's vision to expand across the country and, of course, eventually across the world. All right. So, yeah, back to square one. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next few months. Ken Ham is still alive and well and actively writing, talking, speaking for Answers in Genesis. He's going to be able to carry the load for a little while longer. But at his age, they have to prepare for at any moment there being a giant void in leadership at Answers in Genesis. All right, it's going to be interesting to watch the shakeout and see what comes up. What will rise from the ashes of this this dramatic turn in events at Answers in Genesis? Well, when I find out, I'll let you know. All right, I'll see you when I see you. Bye-bye.